Good morning. Hopefully it's good morning for everyone out there. Welcome to another episode of LunarCrush Live. I hope you are all doing well out there, hanging in there. It's a rough one, rough week in the crypto space, but we've been through it before, right, John?
A few times. Yeah. This is where you learn the most.
Yeah, a lot of things we'll be talking about today. Today we are going to welcome Tor Bear. Hopefully I said his name correct. He's a founder at Secret Foundation. So we'll be discussing Secret Network, some of their strategies. Really excited to have him on. And just a reminder, we do not take payment for our live streams. We bring on fun, exciting people who have dedicated their lives to the Web3 and crypto space. Make sure you get in there and you ask some questions. We will try to do our best to get to them. And hit that subscribe button. We're like legit like YouTubers now. I feel like with 20K subscribers. That's like, do you tell your kids you're a YouTuber now?
Oh yeah, we compete all the time, man. They're
Nice,
jealous
dude.
now.
Nice.
Yep.
Yeah, no, it's legit. Cool. Well, without further adu,
Hey.
hello there, sir. How are you?
It's all right out here. How about you guys?
Surviving, man. Surviving. Quite an interesting week in the market, and we can start there in a second. But welcome to the show. Normally, what we like to do is ask you, where are you in the world, and what's it like there?
Yeah. Physically, I'm in Chicago, which is actually an incredible hub for crypto in the United States. A lot of great companies here. FTX US headquarters is here. A lot of Solana development in Chicago, and then of course, Jump, DRW. Lots of capital flows through the crypto ecosystem via Chicago, and I've lived here most of the last 13 years. It's a great place to be, especially right now because it's finally summer.
Yes, and I'm actually from Chicago, so very
right.
familiar. Suburbs, I have to say. I'm sure anyone from Chicago listening is like, you're not from Chicago.
Thank you for the transparency.
Yes, of course. It is summertime in Chicago. Is like, I live in California now, but in California, it's like going from 50 to 70. Like, it's like a lot nicer, but not that much. In Chicago, it is like 0 to 100. Like, it is like people ditching work. Like, you got those 3 months to just like go down the lake and go to the lake houses and get outside because you've just been like, hibernating for months, right?
Oh yeah. It's true. The city's got a completely different vibe right now. So it's nice to have that going on around me in the physical world, while in our metaverse world, things are a little bit on fire. So it does help for keeping things a little bit in balance. But that said, there's a lot of things to still be excited about in the crypto world, and we are excited. I am excited about all of those things still.
Awesome, man. Well, yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into the space? Where'd you come from? And tell us what's Secret.
Yeah, in some order. So I'll start with what Secret is. Secret's a layer one. So Secret is, in fact, the only layer one blockchain that does privacy live on mainnet now for, gosh, almost 2 years. So we're really excited about how the ecosystem has grown in those 2 years. And we have a huge community of secret agents, many of whom are probably watching, who are privacy advocates internationally, but also, here in America, but in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, where, privacy is resonant all over the world as a human right. What we try to do is expand what it's possible to build with Web3 technology by introducing programmable privacy to applications. You might notice that everything you've ever done on a blockchain is absolutely 100% public to everybody. Not just an application, not just the other user, but absolutely every person. And a lot of the Web3 narrative is about creating empowering technologies, revolutionizing what we're able to do with the internet. So much more of that has to do actually with privacy than just strictly decentralizing something. So we sit at the intersection of that ethos. How do we decentralize things, make them more permissionless, but also how do we secure things for the people who are going to then be relying on these systems, whether they're individuals or institutions or otherwise? So that's what Secret is. And I think you also wanted to know who I was.
Yeah.
less interesting, I think. I think the mission of the project is super fascinating. I've been working in the Secret ecosystem for the last 5 years. So since 2017, full time. And before that, I had a number of positions. I was a data science guy. I was on product teams. I worked at places like Snapchat, Spotify. I started my career as a derivatives trader, actually. So I started as a TradFi guy, but mostly as a high frequency trader. So I was on the pirate ships, right? Not on the British Navy. The people who sailed around and tried to scrape all the pennies out of the markets. That's how I started my career. And it gave me a very deep appreciation and fear, a healthy fear for volatility. So I understand the crypto markets, both on a technical level and on a market level. It's good to be able to hold both perspectives simultaneously, because you start to think about systems at every level. And that includes the community. That's something that I'd be super excited to talk about, is how community systems are interreliant with the technologies, are interreliant with the markets, so on and so forth. And the only reason I'm involved in crypto at all is because I got very lucky to be, I was a graduate student at MIT exactly when they were incubating all the Bitcoin core devs and when they were starting to teach courses. So if it weren't for that, I probably wouldn't have had as much exposure to the technology versus the markets. If I had only been exposed to the markets, I never would have chosen to work in this industry, because it would have been just all volatility. It would have just seemed like a total speculative, home for.
If you are listening out there, we're getting Tor just kind of in and out a little bit here. We'll just give him a second to pop back into. There you go.
I swear.
Nice.
There you go.
Yeah.
Apologies.
No. You talk a little bit about, like, it's a very timely conversation right there of like volatility and speculation in markets, and I've been having just kind of bumping into a lot of kind of traditional venture folks in the last week or two here, and they're still kind of asking me questions about utility and what's the real world value of all of this and what's going on. And I like that you saw the technology first and you saw what could potentially be built. I mean, that was the same thing that I saw. And it's like all new markets start with like infrastructure, and it's like even if you just said like, hey, we're just going to replace like banks, right? Like, what does Bank of America look like? What is the overhead there? How many people work there? You subsidize their building that they pay for and in Manhattan, and like, with a DEX or a DeFi lending platform, like it's just owned by the community. And like
Right.
that, like it's hard to explain to people, the value of what's going on when it's literally disrupting every single thing that it touches, or it will disrupt everything that it touches. It's like, how do you explain that to maybe more of like a layman's terms? You're out for spring at a bar in Chicago and someone's like, what is this? What's going on? It's like, how
Right.
do you explain that impact, like that monumental impact, in like a short way?
I try to tell people, I mean, we have a very unique perspective. We stand for something very specific within the blockchain space. So my story usually starts with what it says on the hat, which is privacy.
Mhm.
And I talk about how, a lot of our systems globally are at risk from centralization and over centralization, but just as much they're at risk from a lack of privacy protections for users. And they're very tightly related. A lot of the failures of Facebook are both centralization failures and privacy failures. So I say, like, to them, like, we're trying to build things that can be privacy preserving, but also decentralized, because you can't really have one solution without the other. You have to have both sides of that to build solutions that we think are going to be sustainable. It's not enough to just build privacy solutions that are very centralized, because those are points of failure. And if we're going to rely on these privacy technologies, they can't have a bunch of points of failure like that. Similarly, just because something is decentralized doesn't mean it's better for the user if it's also going to be a security risk. So it's a lot of education to say, how is decentralization related to privacy? How is privacy related to decentralization? But overall, it's one big story about building this tech can be hugely empowering if we focus on those real world use cases, if we focus on actually onboarding, millions of users, however long that takes. But it does dilute the narrative a little bit when it comes down to, how can we make as much money as fast as possible? And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that, and a lot of the times it's louder than my voice, for sure.
it's interesting coming from someone that was in high frequency trading, but at least
Oh
it
yeah.
sounds like maybe you learned the lesson that you needed to learn there. You're right though, because it's like if you have like a regular layer one, yes, you have your custody, but you don't have your privacy. If you are potentially in a centralized place that you have some privacy, but you don't have custody, but you don't have autonomy over that privacy, there's employees and other people that work there that could so it's like a veil of privacy, I would say. And then you have what you guys are trying to do, which is privacy and custody in a way where it's like, and that's what they're afraid of. Right. And we all know who there is, but it's like, that's what they're afraid of because they're saying, oh, you have this black box now. But at the same time,
Yeah.
it's like, that's just the option. That's what the user and that's what the person wants. And they have the veil of that at a
Yeah.
centralized service. Right.
Yeah. I always hesitate right before somebody says it's like, well, secret's building what they don't want you to have. And I try to make the point that like the powers that be appreciate privacy very deeply. They just don't like your privacy very much. Their privacy is sacrosanct, right? That's the most important thing in the world to a government with its own secrets, right? Or a for-profit enterprise that has trade secrets. They very ruthlessly govern their own privacy, but when it comes to the privacy of citizens or privacy of users, that's a means to an end. But everybody can benefit from systems, just like the whole can't be evil mindset of blockchain. My cat's gonna, yep. the whole can't be evil principles of blockchain, right? We want to make these systems less exploitable if we can. We shouldn't even give somebody else the option to screw up, even if we trust them. How do we make these more trustless systems so we don't have to take somebody else's word for it? And in the context of, you asked me like, did I learn my lessons from high frequency trading? And that's, yeah, if I wanted to just make a shit ton of money, I would have stayed. Ooh, can I swear? I would have stayed a high frequency trader, and you make plenty of money doing that, especially when things get volatile, and it's a very volatile world right now. But if you actually want to like build something, you go build it. There's only so many chances you get to do that. I did learn my lesson as a data scientist too, though, because as a data scientist, you see 100 million ways in which data is exploited and not private and not secured in ways that will never be legislated against because it's death by a million cuts. And then the stories that came out about Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, or all the credit scores getting hacked and everything out of Experian, like it's terrifying what goes on. And I experienced that terror internally, where the attitude was not how do we stop this, but like what are we going to do about it, right? Like that's just life, and it shouldn't just be life. It's a lot more fun. Well, I shouldn't say fun. It's not always fun, but it's definitely a lot more empowering to think that just a little bit of what we're trying to build in the secret ecosystem could positively impact that, not because it's so countercultural or so much against what regulators or enterprises would want. It's revolutionary because we're giving them another option that didn't exist. We're giving users another option, but we're also giving institutions another option, which means when they choose an option that kills your privacy or doesn't empower you, right? They used to be able to only option. This is the way things have always been done. Give people another option. And now they have to explain to you why the default is surveillance capitalism, why the default is a system that so deeply exploits its own users. Without alternatives, we can't build those systems, but we're not going to say we build these and they don't want you to have it. Some people who work in government and enterprise really do want you to have these systems. They just don't know how to build it themselves.
How do you view, what's the role of exchanges in this? Because, if I were to buy a privacy token on an exchange, transfer it off, use it from a application perspective, I'm kind of doxxed in a way. Like I've KYC'd.
Yeah.
It's now gone to a wallet that's obviously mine. I'm now not private. Like, how do you view the exchange's role within the privacy space?
The way I think about privacy and the way I explain it is not as an absolute where, I want my privacy because I don't want anybody to know anything about me. Once you start dealing with privacy as an absolute, first of all, there is no such thing as absolute privacy. So once you start dealing with it as an absolute, you're confusing the issue right away from a technological perspective as well. There's always trade-offs to some degree. Everything costs something to do in life, no matter what it is. And privacy is no exception. There's always some sort of cost or trade-off with having it. For us, we just want to make sure that trade-off isn't something like the user experience, or it isn't something that's just like unacceptable. Like our solution to privacy is not having a solution to privacy. Getting off of zero is a huge deal. And a lot of the returns to the user from having additional privacy are in the first 20% extra private things you get, give you like 80% of the value of privacy. And then you want to work over time to giving even more benefits with even less cost to the user. So first, I'll stress that. So then the way we thought about secret and the architecture was not like, how do we make this so that it's perfect privacy in the sense that no one should ever know anything about you? It's more, what's the right architecture to make this sustainable and to make sure users are protected when they use applications that they need to be able to trust trustlessly. So the way the network works is that secret, the native coin of the blockchain, is not a privacy coin like Monero, where everything you do with secret, the coin on the network, is encrypted. That exchanges don't like anyway, and governments don't like anyway. As soon as your coin only exists to evade surveillance, you are now a tool for money launderers and terrorism financiers and things like that. Making that architectural choice actually sets you up for failure in a number of ways, where you don't even get to grow big enough in the first place to truly matter, right? The whole point of all this is making global impact, not building in a vacuum and trying to get around the systems we already have as a society. It's about how do we influence those systems to be better by providing alternatives to existing systems that can be just as easily adopted by end users. So now you take your secret off an exchange, let's say, because you want to use an application on the network. It's in your wallet, and that can be public. But if you choose, you can take your secret, you can wrap it as a privacy token. You can wrap it, let's say, we call it secret, when you turn the native coin into like a privacy version of that coin. And then when you're using that coin in applications on the network, aspect of those interactions are all going to be encrypted, meaning you're not forced to expose every aspect of that interaction with the application to every other user of the blockchain. The same way that when you're, looking at your bank account, you're not forced to reveal everything you've ever done with your credit card to every other person who owns the credit card. Now, those are the kinds of choices you need to be able to have as a user. It doesn't mean you never want to reveal something. Maybe we're totally comfortable paying our taxes. I strongly advise everybody listening to pay your taxes, right? Like that's not why we exist. We exist to make sure you can use trustless systems without also needing to give up privacy. That's a false choice.
So on that note, there's an interesting question here from where'd you go? There you go. From LunarCrush. How do you see the killer app for privacy, and what kind of application is on secret that more people can use? And I think that's an interesting question. It's like, well, what are some of the things that require partial privacy, full privacy? How do you see that?
I think the most critical thing we've seen in the last year has been the emergence of this metaverse ecosystem in terms of telling the privacy story. Because when your privacy story used to only be about DeFi, right? Like we needed permissionless leverage into everything, right? People didn't care about privacy. They cared about making as much money as they regular financial lives. Privacy is essential, right? Merchants require privacy to protect the users of their business. We require privacy when we're interacting with our banks, with our creditors, whatever else. It just kind of gets swept under the rug if your only goal is to speculate as fast and as much as possible. And that was dominating the landscape for quite some time. But NFTs are something different. The idea that you can have these assets that are designed to be specialized to you. They're one of one, or they're part of a small community of people with a shared identity, things that are linked to you as a human. We start to think a lot more carefully about what does this mean for my privacy? If you own something, for example, that's an NFT, and everyone in your social circles knows you own the NFT, and then they find the NFT on the blockchain, whether you revealed it to them or not willingly, they now know exactly which wallet is yours, which also tells them everything that you own now and ever owned.
Yeah. All the inflows, outflows. We actually, it was kind of fun. We had Gary Vee on a blockchain and booze like 8 months ago. And it was like kind of early days of like some of the NFT stuff, which he was actually a little late to, but early compared to the rest of the retail market. And like, he was just getting airdropped just so many NFTs and so many tokens, and they got to see all the ETH that he had, and like all the ETH inflows and outflows forever, and like it's not a place that you want to be, especially as like a public figure, of having like your entire history doxed, whether or not it's legitimate, or like, most of the time probably it is. People are just like, oh my God, I don't want, that's why a lot of like billionaires and stuff, they always claim they donated all of their wealth to charity, even though they still have it. Cause it's like, they're like, yeah, I have zero now. And so I like, when you talked about controls and like customization of what's private and what's not, like my mind started going crazy, because I was like, man, every single like D app that you log into, whether it be like with a MetaMask or like whatever it may be, like you want to like have some other interstitial that comes up and says, what exactly like do you want to be sharing out, and what do you not want to be sharing out? And like that layer of control has been missing from our space.
It is the missing layer of control. We talk about it as native privacy, but also native access control. So in the context of NFTs specifically, right? Like we have things where you can like log into to a community or to an application with your NFT, and in that way your NFT sort of becomes like your browser cookie. But what if our browser history? Sorry to horrify anybody listening to this who's here from Reddit. What if your browser history was public to absolutely everyone? And what if all of your cookies and the content of all of your cookies were public to everybody? That's essentially what the blockchain is asking you to do. If you're on ETH, if you're on Solana, if you're on Near, something like that. If you're on Secret, we use a private by default data model. So everything is encrypted unless it's not supposed to be. So you give permissions to applications, to contracts, to be able to read the private metadata. An NFT on Secret can have private ownership, and it can also have private metadata. So if you go and you try to find my NFT wallet, you can know exactly which NFT I have. You won't be able to associate it necessarily with the wallet that holds it. And if I send it to a new wallet, you're not going to see the NFT go to the new wallet unless I choose to reveal that link, or choose to reveal it, let's say, in the new wallet, because that's how actual physical things work in the real world. This is how every asset has always worked, until we figured out a way to build a system that was so transparent that we ruined the whole point of property in the first place, which is to be able to have this kind of control as an owner. And we just accept it because numbers went up forever, right? So it's like, well, clearly this has to be the way the technology was meant to be, otherwise it wouldn't be so valuable, right? How could a Bored Ape possibly be worth $1 million if this wasn't the way property was supposed to work? Well, bear markets make people think differently again about like, did we actually mean for things to happen this way? Or did we just build a really good speculative system around fundamentally broken assets that we can fix now with native privacy technologies? We have the opportunity to rebuild everything on Secret the way it should have been built for the decentralized world from the beginning. It's just that privacy is hard. So we didn't start with privacy. Bitcoin didn't start private. It also didn't start with smart contracts. All these things that have been introduced to the blockchain space have come through iteration, experimentation, innovation. So with Secret, we've said, let's have smart contracts. Let's also have privacy. Let's slap what Ethereum is doing together with what Monero and Zcash have tried to do. Let's create a programmable ecosystem where the contracts are programmable, but so are the data access controls. What could you possibly build? There's Secret starting to experiment with what is this future world of non-fungibility going to look like?
Yeah,
I'm gonna guess I cut out for the fun part.
We got you back. Yeah, and it's thinking on that. It's like it's kind of like, why would someone with $1 billion of Bitcoin hold it on an exchange, right? When there's still no FDIC insurance, or like, it's just as safe for them to have it in like a cold storage wallet if they literally know what they're doing in their own possession. And it's probably because they don't want maybe their address doxed, right? Or like they want, it's like a part of privacy is being on a centralized exchange for people, and that is inherently risky, especially in a moment like right now, where you're looking at what's going to happen if there's these capital calls and stuff. And I mean, I do want to touch on Terra, because I feel like it fits a little bit with what we're talking about here. With we don't want like USDT that's backed by tips and other things. It's like that's the old guard, that's the old model, right? Even though it's still a step forward, because our current banking system has 0% reserve requirements, and it looks like USDT has been audited, and they definitely have more than zero.
Yeah.
And so it's like, sure,
But
that's
it's not over collateralized, that's for sure.
right. But at the same time, that's why I think everyone was rooting so much for something like UST, because it was a
Yeah.
pure like algorithmic stablecoin. But they went down the route of, hey, we're still going to be listed 350 different pairings, and then it becomes a market making and a centralized exchange problem, right? It's not an algorithmic stablecoin. They're like, oh, the peg we didn't lose the peg on the blockchain. It's like, well, that obviously doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's an attack vector. Anything that has these external systems has external attack vectors. But to be fair to the Terra team, who we know very well and deeply respect and love, and
Yeah.
Oh, that was going to be a good comment.
Any hurt by the.
We'll give him a second. We'll give you a second to recover, and then we definitely want to hear your comment, because we know those folks too, and we know that they were doing it the right way, right? Like they were doing it like the most decentralized way possible with the DAO and everything else. And it's like, you truly wish like whoever potentially did do this in a way that, whatever happened, we're not pointing fingers, that, man, it would have been cool if they would have just put their intelligence to work in a positive manner.
for whoever ended up trying to exploit the system.
Yeah.
You're saying? Yeah. Unfortunately, we all develop in adversarial environments, and we have to expect these sorts of things to happen, right? Like, but when I say like we have a lot of respect for that ecosystem, like they were deploying, like the community members, as much as Terraform Labs or anybody else involved, were deploying human capital and actual capital into the secret ecosystem. We're essentially neighbors via IBC. We're all part of this like Cosmos ecosystem. So we're very close to there's a. Am I still with?
I'll give you a second here. Let the
yeah.
If you end up needing to kill the video, it's all, we'll do the rest in audio, which is all good. But
oh, you guys know what I look like.
All right, go for it. Try it again.
Let's see if that helps. Let's see if that helps doing it this way. So yeah. There's a lot of overlap. Look, it could have collapsed this week. It could have collapsed months ago. It could have collapsed months from now. I don't even think it was inevitable that this model would fundamentally collapse. It had to happen a certain way at a certain time. It was a very, I don't want to say planned attack, but it was a very opportunistic outcome where they took advantage of multiple single time opportunities, like before the Bitcoin pegging mechanisms were deployed, as the curve pools were being migrated. Like it was like now or never in a lot of ways. So I don't think that this was like inevitable. I don't think people did the wrong thing. I think that just they ran out of time, and somebody had enough motivation and enough capital to accelerate something that I think like no one was working harder or faster than the Terra ecosystem. At least not as I observed out in the blockchain space. And sometimes even that's not enough when the world moves this fast and when there's this many opportunities in the attack surface, right? So every blockchain has an attack surface somewhere in the whole thing. And this is what we talked about at the top with all of these interconnected systems. Sometimes it's through the socials there. Sometimes it's going to be the technology itself, something that happens on chain. Sometimes it's going to be an attack surface through the markets, because you need to be able to acquire the coin to use the chain, or acquire the token to use the application. So somewhere in these interconnected systems, there's vulnerabilities. The question is, how do those vulnerabilities interact? How do you secure them? And what is acceptable risk? And if all of your vulnerabilities exist sort of simultaneously and can be exploited simultaneously, no one is safe. And that's the point of decentralization, is to distribute the attack surface enough that these systems can be sustainable while remaining trustless. And they were just below that threshold, which reminds us just how hard it is to build those kinds of systems. I think the difference between Terra and other chains was just the level of ambition. And if they had been 100th the size, 1/10 the size when this had happened, it would have been slightly different than trying to do these things at the scale of the 5th largest chain in the world. And when you put that target on your backs, it's hard. It's hard. I have nothing but respect for anybody involved in the Terra ecosystem. I just know they signed up to do a really tough thing. And this is the most unfortunate outcome that I could imagine.
Well said. And yeah, I completely agree with you. And it's the attack vector was very clear there, for this instance, at least. And so how do we, I mean, it's like, how do you, like, obviously, you know, you've got to decrease these attack vectors, like you're saying. But it's like, what is the next iteration of this, you know, and where does it go from here? You know, you got a lot of people out there right now thinking to themselves, you know, even last night as I was staying awake at 1, I mean, I saw the USDT peg go down to like 88 maybe. And I was like, you know, that was like, not sure exactly how I fell asleep after that, but you know, I was like, man, if this starts to go, like, this is going to be an interesting scenario tomorrow. Looks like it's going to hold up. They've got a little bit of a different structure there, but like, you know, where do we go from here with, you know, like, what do we learn from what happened with Terra?
I think that we need to be patient with our learnings, because it's been about, 24 to 48 hours since things really came to a head. And we would have had completely different takeaways a month ago or 3 months ago when everybody declared it, the world's first perpetual motion machine. And, we're probably going to feel differently in 4 weeks from now when we realize exactly who was responsible for exploiting the attack vectors that existed, or when we find out what what downstream impacts there were. Something like this causes an earthquake because you don't know who had exposure to what. Right. And that's not all on the blockchain. That's just like people are holding things in custody, or they have debts, like things that the blockchain doesn't necessarily record. So it's not a transparency issue. It's just we haven't found out yet who's solvent and who's not. It is a little bit of a Lehman moment in that way. We don't know yet who held the exposure to what is essentially now a distressed asset that's being marked to market. It was backed by fundamentally the algorithm, not by some sort of under collateralized model even. It was just backed by itself, essentially, at the end of the day, with an asset that can hyperinflate by 50x in the span of 24 hours. So in those kinds of circumstances, it's like, what do you learn? Well, you learn that this particular thing failed in this particular way. But taking something away to say this is always an inevitability, or stable coins will always fail beyond a certain scale, or anything like that is obviously wrong. And the experimentation will continue. The temptation will be for regulators to step in and say, we should stop experimenting because it's dangerous. People can get hurt. And yeah, people can always get hurt with new and speculative technologies. Absolutely. But if the alternative is to stop experimenting with these models and just hand this over to say, well, who's got a really good idea of how to do stable coins, right? The Federal Reserve. I trust them to do it. Then we're going to end up with even more surveillable money than we've ever had at any point in history. The CBDCs are going to use it. The central bank digital currencies will use it as an opportunity to say, we're the only people you can trust to create money. And also, we should say how it's built. We can't trust the users to tell us how to build their money. Look what they did. Look what a community did. So we're going to tell you how we're going to build the money. Oh, you want privacy? Well, here's the risks as we see it. Therefore, this will be the only acceptable model. All the risks to me are in allowing that to be the takeaway, because one thing failed, we will now give up fundamental rights around decentralization and the right to privacy and things like that in favor of handing things over to more authoritarian structures.
Yeah. And you know what? It's like, it's the same thing where,
right. And
it's
like,
like,
why we take off our shoes at airports.
Well, it's like we could leave it in the hands of, potentially, and if it comes out that, this was, like you said, or we're all speculating that some sort of calculated attack by probably some sort of investment vehicle run out of maybe one of the largest next cities in the Northeast. I'm not going to point fingers yet, but I'm assuming it's probably going to be down that rabbit hole. And they did that. Like, it wasn't the community, it was a person exploiting something. Right. And then it's like, well, who else do we leave it in the hands of? Do we leave it in the hands of the bankers and Lehman and, basically them deciding to give AIG insurance money to this pick a winner in Goldman Sachs, where it just so happens that the person that was running, the treasury at the time also used to be the CEO there. Right. It's like, at least in this scenario, like, there is fallout. Like, I agree. Like, that's a good point. I wasn't thinking about that, of like, where's some of the debts that's due from the people that maybe had 500 million or 100 or $1 billion tied up in this, but at least the there's not going to be the cascading effect of like every investment bank and all of like everyone's mortgages going under and like people underwater in that sense. It's like it's a little bit more like UST didn't, at least right now, it doesn't look like it's also taking down USDT directly, right? Or USDC. It's like it's somewhat isolated to that smaller sector where back in 2008, the rest of the taxpayers were left holding the bag, right? And so it's like it's still a better experiment, but like you said, I hope that they don't spin this and say, well, look what happened here, but you never know.
All right. It sort of leaves you without
don't we have another
ammunition
issue
as an industry.
Don't we have another issue with, I mean, when you look at take Tether or take a lot of the other stable coins, you know, we're talking crypto so far, like as if this is just, there's an exploit that was crypto related and it didn't have too much of an impact. But what happens, and I was watching Tether too all night last night, and it just got me thinking. I'm like, if these stable coins are pegged against traditional assets that let it be pegged to $1, what happens if in a macro environment those traditional assets become worthless or worth a lot less? And if you end up, you know, like, and that's what scares me the most, because I don't know, there's not enough transparency around what those assets are across all of these stable coins. And, you know, look at the stock market. It's just as brutal, if not more. From a market cap perspective, it's terrible. You look at some of the top stocks out there doing awful. And it's like how do you guys see this playing out when the value of these stable coins is pegged against those traditional assets?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how I feel about, let's say, like gold-backed stable coins and things like that, or things that are really these other vehicles. And there a lot of things are open to interpretation about, like, do these represent some kind of regulatable security, commodity, etc., right? Like I stay in my lane for the things where I'm not like a legal or securities expert. My lane is really around like building out these base layers on which a lot of people are experimenting, right? We didn't build any sort of complex stablecoin mechanisms into the base layer of Secret. Secret exists to be one thing, right? It exists to be a privacy hub, like a data privacy hub that can interconnect to every other L1 chain. And as soon as you try to be 100 times more than that, you can grow really, really fast. But this is what can happen on the other side of that. I don't think that's the kind of experimentation that necessarily should, maybe this is one lesson. Maybe we do this less and less at the layer one, because we need to rely on layer ones as a foundation. Like your layer one should not be thoroughly experimental in its economic design. But at the token and application layer, there's a ton of experimentation possible, and should be encouraged, because then we evolutionarily find these more sustainable models. And stablecoins, at least in other contexts like USDC, USDT, are tokens on other chains. And even if those stablecoins start to split, like the blockchain supporting them, like ETH didn't go down, right? ETH has its own infrastructural issues, but it has nothing to do with the stablecoin itself sort of imploding. So there's two separate kind of issues that we're starting to get out here now, right? Like one is like, what do we feel about like stablecoins that are supposed to be backed by assets that themselves are not backed by dollars or under collateralized or some other thing? Those have risks, you know, just like banks are not always backed 100%. Like they don't have to have 100% of the reserves. Like these are risks. What's an acceptable risk in exchange for having a growing economy? That's something we have to figure out. But I think we can, right? The things have to at least be, maybe the threshold is things have to be at least this much collateralized, or at least this secure, in order for us to think that these will be more sustainable. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be allowed to experiment with other models, in my opinion. I just think we're learning enough to say those other models have risks. And now that people know how to exploit those risks, we can safely assume more likelihood in the future that people will try to exploit stablecoins that rely on specifically this model, because they know how.
Tor, I'm looking at like your site right now, which is like really well done, man. And you guys, I mean, you said it's been a couple of years, but you know, it seems like in the last couple of months here, you know, number of addresses is going up. Looks like a lot of the social stuff is going up. I mean, I saw you guys even did like an NFT with like Quentin Tarantino. Is that right?
Yeah, that is true.
Which was back in November, though. There was not the increases of addresses was not the NFT with with Quentin Tarantino, there was something else that happened. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
super
The question
cool.
is why now? Like, why is this all super exciting, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think that it's our community, man. Like, we're going back to like maybe why I'm even here in the first place. Like, what's the role in community and scaling entities projects, right? My entire focus with my work in the ecosystem has been about growing community adoption, and not just addresses, because those could be to a large extent generated by whatever means, right? We don't know. But I know when someone's a person and contributing to protocols actively on the network. And as much as we can have the number of net people in the network growing, I have a lot of confidence in our future. But if you build the community based on something that you won't sustainably be able to work towards, right? Then at any time things can kind of implode. We've always put exactly what you see on the website, that privacy ethos, at the center of everything. So people know that if the price falls 80% or something like that, we're not taking our ball and going home. We're really trying to bring this stuff to the world, and we're not going to give up based on some sort of short-term volatility. So that gives community confidence, I think, even in these kind of conflicted times, to say, well, maybe secret is going to be last man standing, right? We're different from every other L1 that exists. Our community is different from every other community that exists. We should reach a different outcome than every other L1. Terra was built differently than every other L1 too, right? And they reached a different outcome. I'm not saying it has to be a good outcome, but I am saying that if you're looking for things in the blockchain space that are built different because you're just interested in building a different future and not just more of the same, right? That's what you'll see all of our messaging positioned around. And I think right now, with all this volatility, people are looking for where, if I want to stay in the space, but everything's crazy, I have no idea what to focus on, I don't know who to listen to. Well, we've been here 5 years. We must be doing something right that we're not dead. So, like, come hang out in the secret ecosystem. You'll kind of see why we survive multiple cycles. And it's not because we're magic. It's just because we have an amazing community that wills it.
It's a great point. And it's, you talk about wall addresses. I literally just had this conversation this morning with someone where I was talking about that, of like, I could easily just send X amount to whatever wallets out there. And, like you can show that growth pretty easily, and you can gamify that, but it's a lot harder to gamify like pure community and sustained community over time, right? Like you could do it maybe in a short cycle and you can see a bunch of social media boost out there and engagement, but like it's expensive and it's almost impossible to like sustain that long term. And so it's that core like groundswell of community and growth, and like that becomes the KPI like in the Web3 space. It's a different feel for like what is this like moving growing thing. It's like for you guys, you're bringing on people to build on the ecosystem. You're building on people to support the ecosystem from a holder standpoint. You're out there doing marketing in a completely different way. You've got to onboard all these people, and it's like it's an organism, versus like a company. And so it's like,
Yeah.
how do you think about managing that from a, like a holder perspective to a developer perspective? I mean, I saw you guys have like an ecosystem fund. I'm not sure if that ecosystem fund is in secret or whatnot. And,
Good question.
there's a lot, we just talked to Cadena, right? And it's like, they launched a fund as well. And it's, they're out there with their incubator and everything else. And it's like, we know, the folks at Algorand and Avalanche and everywhere else, they've all got these funds. And, I could probably state, hey, like that's a $600 million fund like a month ago, but where is it at today? So how are you thinking about bringing on those, like the new developers and the people to build in the ecosystem?
So we do have two separate sources of capital that we announced back in January, February as part of our Shockwave growth initiative. And at the time, it totaled $400 million of capital for builders. And we were saying, this is available, some in the form of grants through our grant program, some in the form of an ecosystem fund. And they're very different models. The grant model is to get somebody from 0 to 1, to make sure we're getting some of the critical tooling into our ecosystem. Some people just build on secret for their own purposes, right? They don't need grant to get started, but they're just like, they're building a business and they're building that business based on open source tooling, or they're running a validator in the network, right? But for other things that are kind of like critical infrastructure where we want to patch gaps in the ecosystem, there is a grants program that helps deploy that capital to early stage builders, non-dilutionary. Then there's the ecosystem fund. And the ecosystem fund is actually sort of a joint venture between 25 independent organizations, all of whom are stakeholders in the secret ecosystem, and all of whom have committed to deploy that capital over the next few years into the secret ecosystem. So that's just that's not like secret price dependent. That's them saying we're already stakeholders in this ecosystem. We want to see it succeed. We've sort of earmarked this capital to be able to support privacy by default applications. And secret is the ecosystem where we believe this is going to work. And they made that determination based on what our current adoption looks like, based on the fact that we're still the only blockchain with mainnet private smart contracts and have been for the last 2 years, based on the fact that we've survived bear market cycles, based on the fact that they've seen our community engagement, right? They didn't just try to shove this down anybody's throat and say, believe in this layer one, we're rich, you should believe us, right? That's not how our ecosystem was built. And there's plenty of that in the blockchain space, but we're sort of the opposite. We had community engagement. We had a huge groundswell of support from people who really want to build privacy-centric technologies. And then VCs sort of caught on to the idea that this was an extremely popular product that people wanted to use, people wanted to build on, and then they lent their support. That, which is, I think, a much more sustainable way to build in the blockchain space. I would certainly say it's the reason for the success of things like Bitcoin and Ethereum. But it's more and more not becoming the dominant model because there's so much money at play, right? And so the layer one wars, right? It's really just a proxy battle for very well capitalized businesses and governments and investment firms, right? And the Terra stablecoin battle ended up being a proxy war for very well capitalized entities.
Might have lost him for a sec.
But I'm back. My point is that like this is what success looks like. The longer you survive, the more you start to see these sort of proxy wars emerge. It happened to the internet. It's going to happen like to everything we ever build going forward. This is just the nature of capitalism. But what I'm saying is, like, if you are a community member now feeling confused or panicky, or you're a dev trying to figure out if you're building on sand or not, I think you should have a lot more confidence coming towards a project in an ecosystem like ours versus like something you were told to like. Go somewhere where people liked it enough to make sure that it existed and survived despite all odds, despite building tech that's not always popular, like privacy tech, right? That's not always a hot narrative for people. Privacy is not fun until you lose it, and then it's all you can think about. But I think what we're seeing now is a lot of that organic support that we've always had being sustained and strengthened. And now a lot of new supporters who have realized if there's anything worth still building in the blockchain space after something like this, it's probably something like privacy that could touch millions of people and help millions of people instead of just, trying to find new ways to create permissionless leverage systems. Not as interesting.
How do you work with your ecosystem? Like, I'm on your site here looking at some of the dApps. Like Alter sounds really cool. I got to try Alter out. Private secure messaging app. Sounds really neat. So like, how does that process work all the way from like, do they come to you with like an idea? Are they building out their own community? Are you helping them? Are you funding them? Like, how does that all come together so that, the next 1,000 dApps that want to get built on Secret look at what's built on it and are super impressed. They want to be part of that ecosystem.
So again, like you is a tough word, right? Because if we were a traditional layer one ecosystem, it's a development company that also has like a BVI or Cayman arm. And here's how we're they're not really decentralized ecosystems. It's just, so there's like a very large business development department and they go around paying lobbyists and things like that. Like that's what people have started to think of as layer one ecosystems. We're the other guys. So when you have a dApp idea in our ecosystem, you come to the ecosystem. There's a few different sources of funding. There's the ecosystem fund where you're pitching the VCs or the community directly. There's the grant program, which is managed by Secret Labs. They're the core developers for layer one right now, but they also contribute at the application layer. But Secret Labs is the core development team. They're based in Israel. I'm at Secret Foundation. We are that marketing and growth and community arm that says, you're in the community, you're building something, we will help you get noticed. We will help you find your first 10,000 users. We will help you tell your story. We will use our larger like secret channels where we tell the network story. and we will tell your application story within it. So for somebody like Altermail, for example, now Alter, right? They've got an incredible product. They're doing all kinds of cool stuff. So we will be their thought partners to say, how do you take this very complex application to market, right? A social messaging platform is a two-sided marketplace between people who want to talk and people who want to listen. And to scale that, you need massive amounts of volume on each side. And a lot of that engagement has to come from outside the secret ecosystem if we don't already have billions of users like Facebook. But you can't build Alter on Facebook because they're antithetical. So we have to become your partners. And what we do as Foundation is we connect you not only with our own internal resources, but we help point the way within the community. Oh, this person is really going to love what you're building because they have this in their portfolio company. This person's really going to love what you're building because they built their own social platform last year. Oh, this person's really going to love what you're building because they're an influencer. They already have 100,000 people in their audience and they're looking for new ways to engage them. And we just connect the dots. That's really our function. We don't want to be a central point of failure for the ecosystem. In fact, we're designed not to be a central point of failure for the ecosystem as an organization. But you do need some sort of way to help direct that traffic so people can discover each other and find value from each other instead of ending up, as we often do in decentralization, in a bunch of silos or relying on, one single party to constantly be being these super connectors or controlling all the capital. I don't think that's what the future of the decentralization space is going to be built on. And that's the thesis that our community structure is completely built around. We're just trying to accelerate and strengthen that structure because we think that's where people are already finding value. And we've put a pretty large bet as a community on that structure winning out in the long term.
So as you do that, how do you look at creating value for that community? I mean, like, are there certain metrics you're looking at that hit that you say, yes, that we did a great job, and us adding these 5 projects to our ecosystem did X? Like, what are you looking at?
That's such a hard question, right? Because you can look at the metrics, but how do you get to attribution? You launch 5 products all at the same time that have a lot of overlap between their user bases. You can see how many users there were for each, maybe because you can see how many individual addresses interacted with each. You can say how much TVL is in each application. You can see how many NFTs were issued, right? But it comes down at the end of the day to user metrics, essentially. How many people got brought into the system? So my ultimate core metric, this is me talking, every project has a sort of different economic model or business model, and they may think about the value proposition differently. But because I think about it mostly at layer 1, people is the fundamental unit of measure and unit of account. And at all times, you need to be growing and retaining. New people need to come in, discover what you're doing, be passionate about it. But in crypto, you're only as good as what you did yesterday. So you have to be equally concerned about retention. So there's these absolute values, and then there's also the flows, the inflows and outflows of of absolute humans in these systems. I look at all 3. I look at the absolute number of people. I look at the change in rates. I look at who's in and who's out. You don't just look and say it was 100,000 today and 99,000 tomorrow. Like, you care about how many people joined in the last 7 days, 7-day active addresses, things like that. As much as you can break things down into that, you'll get a much clearer insight into the growth of your community, both on chain and off. I just think in the crypto space, where that data is extremely fragmented, and where, as a privacy advocate, I don't necessarily think all of it should be directly observable, but it makes it a really hard problem. You just sort of have to trust that the systems you're setting up, even if you can't measure them precisely, you have to have is and retained in the long term. And with Secret, we put the entire bet. Sorry if I cut out. At Secret, we put the entire bet of that system behind the message of privacy, because we know long term that is always going to be a necessity and a public good. We don't have to nail the system the first time, but as long as we never lose that core ethos and core approach to how we build the community, we have some leeway with how we find the right structures and the right measurement long term.
That's a tough question to have, or tough conversation to have with investors and other people out there, where we're always wondering what's the user base? What's everything look like? It's like, well, we're moving to a world where we're not going to know. Right. And so the signal is a little bit different than what you're used to. And if if you're not okay with that, that means that, you want to collect people's data, like on LunarCrush, we don't have cookies on the site. We don't have anything. And it's there's a speed aspect to that. we're going to build everything from scratch. But at the same time, like the tooling, we've had to build so much tooling from scratch to try and understand like Web3 in a Web2 kind of way, because you still want that data to help build the right thing and to grow and to like support the community. And so there's like a completely different way that you have to look at what that community looks like. And, it's kind of part of what we want to solve with LunarCrush. I want to talk really quickly, like, when you think about just Monero, like privacy, like black hole, and it's like, do you think that your brand has kind of gotten like entangled with that a little bit? Like the message now that I'm talking to you and I'm seeing like, more privacy, limitless possibility. You didn't say like pure privacy. You said more privacy, customizable privacy. Like, how are you guys thinking about getting out there with that specific message? Because I feel like, the pure privacy play, like that's not even like at all what you guys are doing. Like you're building a super customizable, better layer one that allows like what you guys think is like a key piece that was missing from the previous iteration of this smart contracting platforms, like in layer ones. And so how are you thinking about like making sure that message gets out there? Because once you understand it, you're like, oh yeah, this is definitely a better option.
Well, one thing we're doing is we're going on podcasts. And so thank you for having us.
That's working.
We hope that's working. But it's exactly like you said, it's an educational issue, because otherwise you do get entangled. And privacy is a very complex topic. People think they understand it because whenever it's covered in the media, it's only covered one way. But it's obviously far more complex than that. And if you think about it for even longer than 10 seconds, a lot of the cognitive dissonances start to become very apparent. Like, here's what we've accepted about NFTs and DeFi and so on. I have to say, though, the more you use Web3 tech, the less time we need with you to explain this, because you've probably experienced the pain point. You've owned an NFT and realized I'm doxxed forever, right? Or you've tried to interact with a DeFi application, you've been front run, and you've lost like all of this value to miners extracting from the chain, which on secret, because all of the interactions with the chain are encrypted, the miners can't get in front of you and exploit that. That's part of the value of the architecture that is kind of out of sight, out of mind, but leaves more value for the users themselves versus the people who are running the systems, which is what we're trying to do. So yeah, huge educational challenge, a lot of iteration on the message so that people can, like you're saying, like that wasn't our first website. The website is a labor of love from a lot of community members who have listened to people in the community to say, what about this is resonant to you? And everybody's told us the possibilities, the experimentation, that kind of culture that we're building again, that reminds us of the early days of Ethereum, or that reminds us of the early 90s in the internet. And they're like, don't lose that. We have to hold on to that. And so we tell the story about how none of that's possible without our core privacy ethos. We're just trying to make 100x things more possible with decentralized technologies. But we can't tell that story unless people actually build 100 times more things. So part of it is our messaging, getting out there, getting these podcasts done, telling the story, and some of it is just, look, you got to build. So getting 100, 200, 1,000 devs building killer dApps on the platform so that people can experience it for themselves. The best education is trying it. And as much as I tell you this is cool, and as much as it can make intuitive sense, until you experience it as an end user, we don't really have you captured, right? We haven't really captured your hearts and minds and gotten you thinking about it until you use it.
That's so true. We were at a conference in London. I got off stage and a dad asked me, I had a dad ask me, how can my daughter get into crypto? And he was like asking for resources to like help her. I said, you know what you need to do? Go spend a few $100 and buy her different tokens of layer ones. Have her, learn how wallets work, learn how DeFi works, go build something, learn smart contracts, like go figure it out and then talk. Then figure out like stop trying to make a quick buck, teach her.
Sure.
But I have a question just around like that growth. I mean, it's undoubtedly early still in crypto. The dApps that have been built so far, for the most part, are fairly small across the board. We're not at the level of like where say Google has been built on blockchain completely. How do you see scalability in the future here. How do you see, like, I guess all of that working together? Is it an interoperable situation? How do you see this working in the future as the applications become so much larger with much more scale needed?
Sorry, let me make sure I got this. Can you say it one more time?
Yeah, so I mean, it's early. A lot of the applications that have been built are fairly small. They don't require a massive load to like the extent of like a Google or a MasterCard yet. And so when we get there, and we saw this, Bored Ape Yacht Club, NFT drop a week ago broke Ethereum. Yet at the same time, everyone's talking about saving the world with blockchain, and it's like we're far from that. So how do you see scalability working with Secret Network, and I guess in general across crypto?
Okay, got it. Yeah, that's what I figured we were trying to get after, because there's other questions around composability at any scale. Something we think about a lot is composability at any scale with privacy, where if you're constantly trying to reinvent privacy into every crypto platform, these platforms end up not being able to talk with each other. Whereas if you build everything and use the same like layer one as a private by default solution for the applications you're building, you can have your privacy, but keep the composability. All these applications can still interact. So, but this also has to do with the question you're really asking, which is at scale, right? How do we think about touching millions and millions of users, millions and millions and billions of data points, and having that make sense? I mean, the easy answer is the lame answer, right? Which is we haven't solved that yet. I mean this as the crypto space, not just Secret. Like no one has solved that scale. And there's always a trade-off with scale. But one of the ways that the Cosmos ecosystem in particular is solving this is through a multi-chain approach. So there's horizontal scalability and then there's vertical scalability. In the horizontal scalability model, you can have like application-specific blockchains, and they all talk to each other via IBC, like inter-blockchain communication protocols. And that way, instead of having these massive point of failure layer ones where everything goes through it for every purpose all of the time, and you need like billions and billions of interactions with that chain, that's really, really hard to do. And there's a lot of questions whether like a layer one like Solana that positions itself entirely around scalability will be able to avoid using things like vertical scaling solutions like rollups, which leads you to question whether a layer one whose entire narrative is around scalability can even compete in the long run, where we have worked out more horizontal and vertical scaling solutions that don't require the layer one to be the most scalable aspect. So with Secret, we haven't bet on like scalability at layer one being the killer feature. We've bet on privacy being the killer feature, that a private by default layer one can provide the most value to a hyper-connected world of independent blockchains, because we could be an issuance and settlement layer for assets, because you'll want to run all private computation logic through Secret, right? That's a way closer vision for where blockchains are going to the actual internet itself, than saying like, oh, the entire internet is Ethereum, the entire internet is Bitcoin, the entire internet is Facebook, right? Or something like that. It is a decentralized model of decentralized networks. And these are all sovereign chains in the Cosmos ecosystem. We operate independently, which is why Terra can have a meltdown event, but Secret is on a relative basis, right? Like our network didn't collapse. Our applications are still resilient, right? We have different sorts of attack vectors and points of failure, where one chain in the Cosmos ecosystem, a stablecoin chain, can go down, essentially implode, and we can still use all of the other networks. That is a more sustainable. So we're thinking about both. We think about horizontal scalability through IBC and through Cosmos. We think about vertical scalability through rollups and things like that. We think about layer one level scalability just to make sure that the chain itself is usable today and in the future. But we think about all of those because they're all part of the solution. And everyone in the blockchain ecosystem broadly and in the Cosmos ecosystem specifically is incentivized to find these solutions together, as opposed to constantly try to solve scalability chain by chain. Where there's going to be more shared solutions like horizontal scalability in the Cosmos. You're going to see more and more of that, I think, as the space evolves.
I think it's smart. It's like, you're right. Like scalability, we saw a little bit of it with that. I think it was other deeds that Mint that went on, where
Yep.
you know, there was like gas was just ridiculously expensive on Ethereum, and you know, they ended up, I think, burning, you know, I forget the protocol is like ERC, wherever, you know, if you overpay for gas, basically it burns the Ethereum, and it was like $150 million that was burnt because there was like a clog and people wanted to mint. And it's like, man, that was just like one specific mint of one NFT project. And yes, it was like a very popular
Yeah.
one. But it was like, man, that is like, you know, that was a moment in time. And, you know, I agree with you where it's like, I don't necessarily know if that is like the killer like feature right now. It's like, I just feel like with blockchain, it's like we are so far from a scaling and like, you know, the cloud, like, you know, the cloud replacement
Right.
in blockchain where it's like, man, like, do you really think that someone is going to wait more than a quarter of a second to not see the next post that comes through or the picture that comes through and what's storage look like? It's like
Yeah.
it's solving something different right now. And especially as we look at, you know, maybe the next 6 to 12 months moving forward. And it's like, I think you guys are positioned really well. I really like it. Like I'm excited to try some of
Thanks.
these dApps
Mhm.
on here, because you're right. It's like it's one thing to say it, and then it's another thing to go use all these dApps and be like, wow, the UX is pretty epic. And like, oh, I can change this. So I didn't know I can change that. And it's like, I think once people realize and see some of those things, like it's gonna move pretty quick, man.
That's the hope. Thanks for helping us get the word out. Thanks for letting people know that there's apps they can already use on mainnet. It's always really fun to come and surprise people, because like when I meet people at conferences and they're like, your story makes a lot of sense, man. So when's mainnet? Or like, how do I get in the pre-sale? I'm like, oh man. Well, and then they're like, the other fun part is like when they're VCs and they just funded somebody for like the tune of 9 figures who says that in 2 years their private smart contract platform is going to hit mainnet, and they think that they're so far ahead of the curve. And then I'm like, well, actually, and then they're like, so why haven't we heard about you? And I'm like, maybe it's a secret. I don't know. Maybe I'm terrible at my job. But
No,
it turns out,
you chose long tail, right? Like John and I, same thing. Like, you know, we with Lunar Token, we already had millions of users. We had like it was 2.5 years after we had already launched and built a product and built utility and built something in, because it's a better model. But you know what? You're not rewarded for that right now in
yeah,
our space. You're rewarded for hype. You're rewarded for all this other crap that has led us to, you know, potentially what has happened in the last 2 weeks. And it's like, you know, folks like yourself are the ones that, you know, are going to be sitting on top of the mountain here in a year or 2 years when everyone else is, you know, going to be back looking for jobs at Google. Right. And it's like, because they
yeah.
built the wrong way. They short-term reward. And that is like never, you know, that value is never, the value doesn't come to people that are looking for that short-term reward. And there's too much of it in this space. But like you said, it's just the optionality is there. And so it's going to attract those people, but the cooler heads will prevail.
Yeah, it's good that you guys have been thinking about the long term already and thinking about the long tail, because the thesis goes that fundamentally is going to matter. And the one thing that takes a million years to build and a minute to destroy is that brand, is
Right.
that ethos, which is why we always put it at the center of everything. And for us, we sum it up as privacy. For you guys, it sounds like you try to sum it up as community. And I think that we're really talking about the same thing at the
Yep.
end of the day, with slightly different implementations. I really appreciate the opportunity, guys.
Yeah.
Can I
Thank
give
you.
out some
Thank you,
channel
Chris.
shout outs so people
Yeah. Yeah. Where can people find you? Shout it out.
come follow Secret Network on Twitter? That's the best way. That's our biggest mouthpiece. But then come to chat.
Oh,
Of course.
Thing you should do is join our Secret Agents program. scrt.network/agents. You'll learn all about how to become a secret agent. We got tens of thousands of people globally who help us create these materials, educating people about privacy, who help us tell this exact story, like you're saying, because it's one thing to come on a podcast. It's another thing for 10,000 people in your time zone to be able to talk to you about what this is, why it matters, what they're building, right? We're trying to build this out as a movement, and we're trying to have tens of thousands, millions of faces attached to that, and not just a single one. So if you want to become a secret agent, there's a million ways to get rewarded for anything you want to build in the ecosystem. And joining now into a small ecosystem you know how it feels to like start when something is small and then see it get really big. Like it's the most satisfying feeling in the world. So
Yeah.
we tell all the secret agents that if you come here now, like we can all be extremely proud and satisfied together in a year or two, knowing that we were trying to build something that we knew what the ethos was. So even if it doesn't work exactly like we think it will, we know that we're building something worth trying for.
Amazing. Well, Tor, man, I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you everyone out there for listening. John, as always, man, it's a pleasure, and we will chat with you backstage.